Hello children, today we shall talk about the abolitions of slavery in France. So dear children, during the Jacobins government, we see that the abolitions of slavery happened. So dear children, in many of the French colonies, we see the slaves who were meeting the growing demands of the European society. There were many French colonies such as the Caribbean, the Martinique, the Guadeloupe, the Saint Domingo. These are the important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar and coffee. So here in these French colonies, we see the important suppliers of commodities which was meeting the demands of the European society. And here, most of the European peoples, they do not want to go to a longer distance, they do not want to go to a unfamiliar areas, and they do not want to work in unfamiliar areas. So when they do not want to work in unfamiliar areas, it is giving the opportunity for the slave peoples to work in the plantations, and when they were working in plantations, it is meant that it is supplying the growing demands of the citizens. So dear children, here when these Europeans are not willing to work in plantations, during that time we see the slave peoples who are willing to work in plantations and meeting the demands of the European society. And in those times we see the slave trade which was being carried by the European countries, the African as well as the Americans. So here the triangular slave trade which was happening between Europe, Africa as well as the Americas. Here the slave trade which had begun in 17th centuries, and here the French merchants are going to African coast, they are purchasing the slaves from the chieftains and from the local peoples, and after purchasing the slaves from the local peoples, they are taking them into the ships, traveling all throughout the sea areas, all throughout these oceans, and they are coming to many of the European countries, and those slaves peoples are working in plantations. They are working hard, they are exploited. After working hard, they are meeting the growing demands of the citizens. So here the plantations worker are the slave peoples who are working in plantations, who are exploited by the peoples, and after working in plantations, these peoples are meeting the growing demands of the European society. The exploitations of slave trade, which is meeting the growing demands of the European societies, and these slaveries or the slave peoples who are meeting the demands in the markets, they are providing sugar, coffee as well as the indigo. And we understood that many times in France, especially throughout 18th centuries, many of the peoples they had discussed to finish the slave trade in the society, but there was great oppositions in the society, because we have seen that the National Assembly, which had debated many times to extend the rights to these slave peoples who are living in colonies, they wanted to give rights to the slave peoples who were living in colonies, but there was lot of oppositions which we see from the businessmen. Why the businessmen were opposing? Because the businessmen were having huge income. They were having huge income from this slave trade. That is why many times in National Assembly, many times in European revolutions, there was a proposal to abolish the slave trade, but it was not at all happened in the society, because most of the businessmen they were having great income only through this slave trade, because the slave peoples were doing more work in the society, and that is the reasons the abolition of slavery was not abolished in those periods. So my dear children, here finally in 1794 we see that in the legislative councils they had passed to free all slaves in the year 1794, but it was happened only for a particular period of time. Only for 10 years the slavery was free, but again when Napoleon who came into power, he reintroduced the slavery. So we understood that the slaves trade was turned to be short-term measures only after 1794, but when Napoleon Bonaparte came into power, he again reintroduced the slavery. So my dear children, here the plantations owner, they were understanding the freedom of the slave peoples. They were enslaving them. The African Negroes were appointed in plantations, and those peoples were enslaved to do many jobs in the society. So there was exploitations of slave. The slave peoples were not having freedom in the society. The slave peoples were not having rights in the society. Though there was debate, there was discussions in the society, in spite of that also it was not at all working properly in the society. My dear children, in the 1794 during the Jacobins clubs, we see they abolished the slave trade. They abolished the slave exploitations. In spite of that, we see the Napoleon Bonaparte who is reintroducing the slave trade in the society, and the plantations owners, they are continuously exploiting the slaves, working them, they are exploiting them hardly, and through that the slave peoples are not having any kind of rights in the society. So my dear children, after a long struggles, the slave trade was finally abolished in 1848. So in 1848 we understood that the slave trade, which had begun in 17th centuries to meet the growing demands of the European society, it was finally abolished in 1848. So my dear children, in this topic we had tried to discuss how the slave trade came into being. The slave trade came into being in 17th centuries. Most of the European merchants going to Africans, they were bringing the slaves with the help of ships, and they were bringing them, then they were selling them in European colonies, and the slave peoples were exploited in the society. After a long year of struggles, after a long year of oppositions, the slavery was abolished in 1848. Thank you so much, my dear children, for listening to me.